Hello and welcome to Deep Dive on NewsX World. I'm Ellie Richardson. One of today's top story is the latest crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important energy choke points, and it is currently at the center of a major global disruption. Let's dive deeper into the energy crisis that is taking place. In the last few days, escalating military conflict between Iran, the United States and Israel has pushed the Strait of Hormuz into a near standstill. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has issued warnings and radio announcements stating that vessels linked to the United States, Israel, Europe and their supporters will not be permitted to transit through the strait. In effect, this has brought commercial traffic to a halt as ships either turn back or avoid the route due to the risk of missile and drone attacks. Maritime traffic has fallen sharply. Industry data suggests shipping through the strait is all but paralysed amid the fighting, with insurers withdrawing war risk cover and many tankers anchored outside the channel. Iran, however, denies that the strait is fully closed to all ships, saying its restrictions are aimed at vessels linked to the US, Israel and Europe, rather than a blanket global blockade. Reporters say only blockaded for US, Israel and EU ships. According to Iranian state statements, the strait remains technically open but restricted for Western-linked shipping. Iranian officials say this move is justified under wartime rights, and they may allow passage to other flagged vessels, including those from friendly or neutral countries. Despite this claim, the reality on the water is stark. Most commercial captains are refusing to risk entry, effectively creating a soft closure. This uncertainty has severe implications for global energy flows. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow stretch of water, at its narrowest just 21 miles wide, that connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. Geographically, it sits between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, making it the only maritime outlet for several of the world's largest oil producers. It is one of the most critical energy choke points on the planet. Roughly 20% of global crude oil and liquefied natural gas passes through this corridor every day under normal conditions. That means millions of barrels of oil and huge volumes of gas heading to energy-hungry economies like Asia, Europe and beyond transit this narrow channel. If disrupted, it instantaneously tightens markets worldwide. Under usual conditions, energy exporters like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE and Iran send their crude and gas through Hormuz. Around 18 to 20 million barrels of oil per day pass here, a figure representing about a fifth of global demand. Major economies in Asia, including China, India, Japan, South Korea and Taiwan, rely heavily on imports through this route. Disruptions immediately pressure pricing and shipping routes globally. Even alternative pipelines, for example from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, cannot fully compensate because most volumes have no practical bypass outside the route. We are also seeing the fallout. This is the state of energy reserves in important nations. With the strait effectively shut, energy stocks and reserves are now in focus. China has some strategic reserves and may weather short-term disruption. India, importing about 40% of its crude from the Middle East, has limited stockpiles, enough for roughly 40 to 45 days' needs, and is now scouting alternatives. East Asian economies like Japan, South Korea and Taiwan hold strategic reserves but will face pressure if supply remains constrained. Many nations are already reducing fuel allocations and rationing supplies amid plunging exports from Qatar, Abu Dhabi and other Gulf producers hit by the conflict. And the markets are reacting sharply. Oil prices surged with Brent and WTI climbing sharply amid war-linked supply fears. US stocks fall sharply with down almost 780 to 800 points and other major indices sliding. Market volatility spikes as investors assess inflation and growth risks. Energy stocks outperform while cyclical sectors lag due to cost pressures. International equities fluctuate with Asian markets mixed and European indices dropping. Exchange rates and central banks under stress with some nations intervening to defend currencies amid oil shock. The Strait of Hormuz crisis is now a central tableau in broader geopolitical conflict. Whether the closure is partial or total, the practical effect is the same right now. Global energy flows are severely disrupted, prices are risking, and markets are in a state of heightened risk. As tensions persist and nations weigh their strategic reserves and alternatives, the world watches closely because any prolonged disruption here will be felt across economies from Asia to Europe and beyond. We are now being joined by Gerald Alfil, who's an economist, and he is joining us from Dubai. Thank you so much for joining us here on Deep Dive.
Good afternoon, Ankita.
Thank you. Our first question is, while Iran claims the strait is technically open to neutral vessels, we're seeing a soft closure driven by the private sector. If maritime insurers like Lloyd's of London continue to withdraw war risk cover or hike premiums by 50% or more, does the legal status even matter anymore? Are we entering an era where insurance companies rather than navies have the final say on global energy security?
Yes, it's a delicate situation. I don't think that insurance companies will dictate now geopolitics, but both go closely together. Also, if you look in the past when there was a rise of piracy at the Horn of Africa, insurance companies likewise said we either have to pull out or there's a solution. And then internationally, many states work together to send more Navy ships to the Horn of Africa to end the problem with piracy. Now, going back to the Straits of Hormuz, technically open, yes, the shipping has obviously declined by 70%, but here in the UAE, the UAE State News Agency, WAM, reported that both the UAE and Oman, the Sultanate of Oman, the Gulf state Oman, are patrolling the Strait of Hormuz and also trying to reinstall the security here. And the power of insurance companies, going back to your question, is of course now visibly more than ever. If you look at stock prices of major insurance companies in the last 5 days, Germany's Allianz SE minus 5%, Swiss Re minus 3%, Munich Re minus 2.5%. They are under pressure and they are now, of course, forced also by shareholders and stakeholders or demand by stakeholders to pull out of those businesses which are too risky. They definitely go hand in hand. There's a lot of communication, as we hear in the UAE, also on back channels. And also China, you mentioned that Asia is dependent on energy flows. China is demanding an end of the hostilities and trying also to mediate between the parties.
And data shows that over 80% of the crude passing through Hormuz is destined for Asian markets, specifically China, India and Japan. Given that the US is now a net exporter of energy and far less reliant on this route than it was in the 1970s, how does this shift the geopolitical calculus? Is the US military currently protecting a global commons, or is it essentially guarding a supply chain that its primary economic rivals depend on more than itself?
Yes, it's an interesting situation because this US administration under President Donald Trump had been critical about the EU's and NATO's attitude towards Russia and the Ukraine war, and they try to also mediate and put an end of the hostilities in Eastern Europe. Now, today, a waiver was issued to India that India can import for 1 month Russian oil, which is new, and this is against EU's policy, which demand from the US also to support more sanctions, more boycotts, more restrictions on Russia. Now, it can be that with this situation with the geopolitical situation here in the Gulf region, that now the European Union and the European states will be forced to follow the US line, because sooner or later they will need Russian energy, which they wanted to put down to zero this year. Germany, for example, still gets a small amount through shipping from Russia of energy, of LNG and oil and gas, but they wanted to finish this. This might be no longer sustainable, this policy. Still, also, we have today just the beginning of March, and it's still cold in Germany. It's around the freezing point in many German cities and also across Europe, and still people have to heat their homes. Oil prices are up, jet fuel prices are up, petrol prices for cars are up. So everything is now up, and all goods which are transported have to be also transported with means of transport which are dependent on petrol. That means sooner or later the Europeans have to see where they get their oil and gas from. Algeria is a big winner in this situation, because Algeria has doubled and tripled its energy supply to European states like Spain, France and Italy, but it will not be sufficient to mitigate the losses which are coming to a total shutdown of Russian supply. Asia, of course, is in a delicate situation, and I want to also emphasize one thing here in the whole discussion. Alternative energies do not play any role in the whole discussion. It's interesting because we were bombarded in the last 10 years that solar energy, wind energy, bioenergy is the future. Now, this geopolitical conflict shows that we are very much dependent still on the traditional carbon energy means and shipping routes. So there's obviously still no alternative to oil and gas and LNG.
Much of the focus is on oil, but this strait is also the exit point for nearly 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, primarily from Qatar. Since LNG cannot be easily rerouted via pipelines like oil can, and global inventories are already tight, could a prolonged Hormuz crisis trigger a gas-to-power crisis in Europe and Asia that is actually more permanent and damaging than the spike in crude prices?
It could be a scenario. However, China has, for example, discovered more oil and gas fields on its own territory. So there are tremendous efforts also to reduce dependency on LNG shipping from the Middle East. Qatar, interestingly, shares the northern gas field with Iran. The northern gas field in the Arabian Gulf is the biggest non-associated gas field. That means there is only gas, there's no mix of oil and gas, which makes the extraction quite cheap and attractive. There are alternative pipelines, but only for oil. For example, the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline from Abu Dhabi to Fujairah, the port city in the UAE at the Indian Ocean, circumvents the Straits of Hormuz, but won't be sufficient, is not sufficient, as analysts say, to mitigate for LNG and oil and gas deliveries. The problem is that you cannot install pipelines and alternative shipping routes too fast, and other alternatives are not feasible or also too expensive. Syria, for example, has today opened an air corridor, but you cannot ship, of course, LNG through air corridors.
Thank you so much, Gerald, for joining us here today on this episode of Deep Dive. Thank you. That was all for this episode of Deep Dive. Stay tuned for more.